I don't know, is 2020 still on your minds? Are you still kind of thinking about that? Usually, for me, the new year is on my mind for about a week and a half. It gets me through that sermon where we talk about New Year stuff. And then it sort of seems to fade in my mind. But I've been thinking more and more about 2020 because it really is more than just a new year, but it's a new decade. And we only get a few of those decades in our lifetime, not that many. And a decade, it just feels bigger. It feels like there's more to it. Probably another thing you've been thinking about is, there's some things that have to change. Have you had that thought? In these last few, there's some things that have to change. Have you said that to your spouse? One of the things we're going to have to change in this new year. I really hate it when conversations go that way, Because usually, what are the things that have to change? Me, that's right. Darla's talking to me. There's some things that have... we've never had that conversation where Darla comes to me and says, there's some things that have to change. That never happened. It usually has to do with me. And that's because it usually is me. Things that have to change. As you think about those things, because it comes to your mind that this is something that has to change, that means it's probably something that's going to be hard to change, right? Because that thing probably goes real deep inside of the core of who you are. And I want to tell you, changing those kinds of things is really tough. We want to talk about wanting to be different and actually being different. And being different is a whole lot harder. There is a wonderful story about a man that Jesus helped change. And I want to share it with you today. It's from Luke chapter 19. You probably will recognize his name. It's a very familiar Bible story. It's about a man by the name of Zacchaeus. In Luke chapter 19, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed in a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and he said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and they began to mutter, "He has gone to be with the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." The little guy, the short guy, we all know little people in our lives, right? The short ones, every family has one, right? They get razzed about it, what they can't reach. Can you help me get this down? That kind of, the short one. And what do short people have to do? They have to be more clever to survive, right? They have to learn how to do things in a little different way because they're short. And Zacchaeus was that kind of guy. He was a short guy. And he heard Jesus was coming, and he knew that in the middle of a crowd he wouldn't be able to see Jesus, so he climbed the tree. A tree right there where Jesus was going to go past. And of course, that sort of gives us an impression about him, like Zacchaeus. He was a guy that knew how to position himself. He knew the best place to be, being short, of course. Knew how to get around obstacles. And it's true. He did know how to get around obstacles because the scripture passage says that he was a chief tax collector and that he was wealthy. Now, if you know anything about the culture and the time and what a tax collector was in Jesus' day, I just have to tell you that tax collectors were unethical and they were corrupt. And they deserved that reputation. And Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector. That means he was a tax collector over other tax collectors, and he had gotten very wealthy doing it. So how did that work? Well, the Romans had basically had defeated and occupied the nation of Israel. And what does an occupying nation want from the people they conquer? Their money, their taxes, to support the troops and the offenses, that the military excursions and all that they have to do in the great empire. So what the Roman government would do is they would find some people that would collect taxes for them, for the Roman government. And they would look for a particular kind of person. And they would look for someone who was greedy. And someone who didn't care about using whatever means necessary to get things done. Because all the Roman Empire cared about was whether or not they got their money. And Zacchaeus was one of those guys. He knew how to position himself. He knew how to get things done. He was a great organizer. He would collect taxes from his own people. He was an arm of the Roman government. Some of you that studied a little history back from our Civil War days, have you heard the term carpetbaggers? I mean, that's really kind of a curse word, right? If you were in the South after the Civil War. Carpetbaggers. These people are coming in and taking advantage of us because we lost the war. And that's what Zacchaeus was. So what the Roman government would do would put at his disposal a group of Roman soldiers, so that if anybody gave him any trouble, they could handle that person. So he had Roman troops to intimidate people, and pretty much they let these tax collectors sort of get whatever they could get from individuals. They had a quota that they had to meet to pay the Roman government, but anything above that quota that they got to keep. So Zacchaeus was a traitor to his own people. Zacchaeus was greedy, and he had made his wealth on the backs of his own people's suffering. It was all legal, but it was all despicable. And can you imagine how his people hated him? When Jesus came to town, and imagine him walking along, and as he came to the tree where Zacchaeus was, he stopped and he talked to this guy. I mean, just talking to him was scandalous. I mean, nobody wanted to talk to Zacchaeus. They wanted this guy to just go away. And Jesus stopped and he looked at Zacchaeus and he says, I have to come to your house today. He invites himself to Zacchaeus' house. Isn't that interesting? Doesn't ask anything else, just, I got to come to your house today. Because that's what Jesus is always interested in doing, right? Coming to our house. So when everybody heard this, the whole crowd just grumbled, muttered. He says he's gone to be the guest of a sinner. I don't know, I guess all these people are still out on the road, and Jesus kind of stopped there at the tree, and Zacchaeus came down, and what? Jesus went with him. What are they doing? They're just standing there thinking like, I can't believe what just happened. Jesus went off with Zacchaeus and left us standing here. We can't believe he's going to do that, be the guest of a sinner. Because everybody knew who Zacchaeus was, and everybody knew what Zacchaeus was. And in their estimation, he was not worthy of God. He was not worthy of any grace. His life was not something that had any value, because he was a tool of their oppressors and their enemies. And so people immediately we're talking trash about Jesus. Jesus says, I have to come to your house today, and that's the only request Jesus makes of Zacchaeus. Man, he had a whole list of things that he could have mentioned that needs to be changed with Zacchaeus' life. And he didn't mention any of that. He says, I have to come to your house today. Because Jesus wants in on his life. He doesn't have to say, you have to change this, you have to do that. He says, I want in on your life. It's interesting, Jesus is demanding or asking nothing. What does the story tell us? Zacchaeus on his own does something. He says, here now I'm going to give half of all my wealth to the poor. Who are the poor? All those people he'd been ripping off for whoever knows how long, right? I'm going to give half of my wealth to the poor. And then he goes on further and he says, and I am going to repay 4 times over anyone I've cheated. And he had cheated people. He says that the poor he's taken advantage of and he's cheated. He wants to make that right with them. And Jesus didn't ask him to do it. He did it on his own. And Jesus didn't say, you got to do it. This all came from Zacchaeus. Now see, this is kind of backward thinking for most of us, right? Because most of us, when we think about what we have to do, it's that. What do I have to do? I mean, I have conversations, every day with Darla, and I says, like, what do I have to do today? And I really kind of mean have to, right? Because if I had my preference, I wouldn't do them, right? But they have to be done. And I guess I have to do them. And we hear people say that, what do I have to do to... Well, no, they don't always say, what do I have to do? They usually say, what do we have to do? But when you say, what do we have to do? You really know what you're asking, right? You're saying, like, what do you want me to do, right? That's what that means. If you go to your boss, in the morning and say, like, what do we got to do today? He'll say, well, you got to do this, you got to do that, you got to do this. He's not coming out to help you. You're doing that on your own. We make lists of these things. What do we call them? Well, I know you call them to-do lists. I call them have-to-do lists, right? Yeah. Have to do. I got to do it. I got to get it done. I remember when I was in college, oftentimes on the first day of class, the professor would give out this, syllabus. This is all the stuff you have to read. These are the books we're going to be studying from. I'm going to give you 4 tests. You have to write 10 papers and all this kind of stuff. And at the very bottom, I don't know if this was a new thought among educators at that time, but they told you what you had to do to get a particular grade. Now, if you score 90 or above on all the tests, and you complete all the reading and turn in all the book reviews and do all this stuff, you'll get an A. And then like, if you make 80 or above on all the exams, well, then you get a B, and then you get a C, And then there's always some joker in the class. What do I have to do just to pass this class, right? You've had those guys in there, right? What do I have to do to pass? And you're looking at them, and you think, loser, right? I mean, this guy wants to know the bare minimum, the bottom of the least he has to do to get the grade so he can get by this class. I think a lot of us, we kind of think that way about Jesus, don't we? What do I really have to do to be close to you? I mean, I get these questions as a pastor all the time. People come to me and say, what do I have to do, to go to heaven? They're not asking how to be a grade A disciple to get into heaven. They're not talking about how can I just knock the top out of all the requirements. They're just thinking like what do you have to do to scrape, to like squeeze under the bottom wire into the heavenly kingdom, right? And how many times we were thinking about that, about following Jesus, and he's talking about the transformation that he wants to do in our lives and those things to change. And we embrace some of those things to change, but pretty soon after we try to work on them because they're so hard, we're thinking to ourselves, do I really have to do this? Pastor, didn't you say that Jesus would love me even if I didn't do them? I think that's something we want to change, right? I think that's one of the things as we think about this decade ahead. If one thing we could do, and that is to stop thinking about what the least we have to do to make Jesus happy, to follow Jesus, to be acceptable and be closer to him. Now here's where we learn something so phenomenal from Zacchaeus. This is a great story. This may be one of the greatest life-changing stories in all the scriptures. Because look, he doesn't ask Jesus, what do I have to do? You know when people come to me and say, well, what do I have to do? You know what the answer is? You already know what to do. You already know what to do. I mean, the fact that you're asking the question, right, means you already know it's something you're supposed to do. You're just looking at how to get out of it, right? Hey, Dad, do I really have to clean my room today? Well, what do you think, son? I mean, you think like Wednesday is a skip day? You don't have to clean your room. You don't have to do that. We already know what the answer is when it comes to Jesus, right? I'm going to tell you today that you already know what to do. Every one of you. You already know what to do. You don't really have to have the conversation. You know what you have to do because Zacchaeus knew what he had to do. When Jesus came to his house, Jesus didn't have to tell him, Zacchaeus, now, you're going to have to change. That wasn't in the conversation. I mean, Zacchaeus, he knew he had to change. But it's more that it wasn't just that he had to change, but he wanted to change. I mean, read that text clearly, and Jesus doesn't point out his sin. He doesn't, Zacchaeus doesn't have to go read his Bible and try to find the answer. I mean, he doesn't have to talk to 5 trusted friends and try to figure it out. He knew immediately what he had to do. He knew he had to deal with that whole issue of greed. Because greed had defined him, identified his reputation in the entire community. And, I mean, he knew that greed was wrong. He knew that the greed that he had and inflicted on other people was wrong. He knew what to do. And when he heard people trashing Jesus' reputation because Jesus came to his house, look at what he does. This is all coming from Zacchaeus. It's not coming from Jesus. Zacchaeus says, Jesus, right now, from here now, I'm going to give half of everything I have to the poor. He made this sweeping declaration. Everybody has known me in this town as a greedy trader. I've turned on my people. I have taken their money. I've been an instrument of this evil, oppressive Roman Empire. I put money in the bank that I took away from people who couldn't even feed their kids. That's what's defined me. And he says, I'm going to give half of everything I have to the poor. He says, from now on, you're going to know me as the guy who gives half of everything I have to the poor. That's going to define me. I'm not going to be defined by my greed anymore, but by my generosity, by my giving. And then he says, and the people that I have cheated, because he cheated a bunch of them, he says, I'm going to give them 4 times back what I took from them. 4 times. You see, this is what we learn from Zacchaeus. First of all, We know the answer to the question of what we need to do. Every one of us. We know it. At home, at church, with other people. And Zacchaeus teaches us that. We know what to do. And the next thing he does is he teaches us is that we need to make things right with other people. We need to make things right with other people. That's a big sweeping declaration. I'm not the greedy trader anymore. I am going to give half everything I have to the poor. But then he starts defining how he's going to live each and every day of his life, and that is, the people I've cheated, I'm going to pay them back 4 times. I'm going to be a 4-time kind of person. Because before, people said I didn't care about anybody. I took advantage of it. And I'm going to say now I do care about it. I'm going to change. I'm going to be generous, and I'm going to try to restore the people that I've hurt. I'm going to try to be a healer rather than a taker. A giver rather than an opportunist for his own self. These are powerful ideas for us as we think about what we need to do in 2020. The things that we want to change. And I think we want to move from just saying, like, okay, what I have to change. The truth is, you don't have to change anything. You can just be that same old person you were last year, right? You can. Jesus says, Zacchaeus, come down because I have to go to your house this day. And he said, great, let's go. And he's walking off, and what does he hear people doing? Trashing Jesus' reputation. Yeah, I think he knew something about that, right? Because I think they said that kind of garbage about him all the time. He heard and he recognized that Jesus was willing to let his reputation be trashed so that Jesus could come to Zacchaeus' house. That's telling us a lot about the character of Jesus, right? He doesn't shy away from other people's criticism to get in the way of him reaching out and connecting with people who need him and whose hearts are open. And that's a powerful lesson for us. I mean, that's a picture of grace. There's nothing that Jesus won't do to come to our house. There's nothing Jesus won't do to bring us in to his presence. And the proof of that is the cross. If you read the scriptures and you listen to what the crowd said about Jesus that final week of his life, as they trashed him, as they called him a traitor, an insurrectionist, and Jesus still was there for us. Still there for us. He will take the criticism to come into our lives. And the beautiful thing about what Zacchaeus does is that he responds in such a way so that his life in the future then could bring honor to Jesus. Think about what people would continue to say about Zacchaeus if he'd never met Jesus. They would have still called him the same name, same scoundrel, same traitor, same greedy old guy. But after Jesus came and his life completely turned around, when they talked about Zacchaeus, imagine what they said about Jesus. What we do in our lives after Jesus connects to us, it has a huge impact on what people think, how people think about Jesus. I mean, one of the things that we should endeavor to do, and that's live a life that is in such a way honoring Jesus that Jesus' reputation is enlarged rather than reduced. And then finally, if you look at the way Zacchaeus changed, he did way more than was required, right? Zacchaeus puts in play this whole idea of being a 4 times kind of person. And that is, they're going to go above and beyond what's required. And I think that's a challenge for us. There's some areas in our life where we know that we need to make a change, and we need to go above and beyond. Maybe that change is just right in the heart of your spiritual life. And you need to not take a small step, but you need to take 4 major steps to move forward to where Christ wants you to be. Because you already know what you're supposed to do. You already know. And you have everything before you to reach out through the power of Jesus Christ to make things right with other people. Make them right. And then be someone who goes more than just required. That does more than's required. If you have a situation at home with your spouse, maybe anger or maybe avoidance or just the way you've treated your spouse, you say, I know that needs to change. Well, then be a 4 times kind of person. And that is to make that such an important issue inside of you that you're going to take 4 extra steps to make sure you're considered, you're caring. You're going to do everything you can to really live up to that promise and that commitment of what you're going to do, what Jesus wants you to do, what you know you should do. The gospel is so beautiful here. And that is, Jesus doesn't force Zacchaeus, and he's not going to force you to do anything. But the gospel is that Jesus wants to get close to you, and he'll help you with all of this. He'll help you with all of it. You know, the invitation of the gospel is Jesus wants to come to your house, where you live, where all your stuff's at. Good stuff, bad stuff. That place where you really are you, authentic. Jesus wants to come there. And he wants a relationship with you. You know, what he doesn't say is, okay, Zacchaeus, I hope you keep your promise. He doesn't say that, does he? He doesn't say, well, Zacchaeus, there's a couple of other things you got to do too. He's being led. He knows what he needs to do. And Jesus affirms that. And Jesus says in the last 2 verses, he says, today salvation has come to this house. You know why? Because for many, many years, it was the traitor, it was the greedy rich man that came to this house night after night after night after night. And Jesus says to Zacchaeus, today, this day, salvation came to this house. Forgiveness came to this house. Jesus' presence came to this house. This house was a place where the future was going to be different. For a year, for a decade, for the rest of Zacchaeus' life. Salvation came to that house because this man too is a son of Abraham. You think about all the things that they called Zacchaeus, son of, right? Think about it. They had a lot of those names for him. But Jesus says, no. He's a son of Abraham. He's a child of God. For this reason, the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. That's what Jesus is all about. And he still is. He still is. I'd like to invite you to factor what we learned from Zacchaeus, into our thoughts about 2020, the new decade that's ahead of us. You know in your hearts what needs to change. You know those places where things need to be made right, where you need to focus your energy and ask for help for Jesus to be that 4 times kind of person in that area where you weak, where you stumble, where you've had problems. Be a 4 times kind of person. Be the kind of person that says, Jesus, you came to my house and I want you to stay. Wouldn't that be a beautiful 2020 decade?